Wells Fargo Advisors, represented tonight by Kevin Loki, Nina and Clint Brady, and Marion Moore. I also want to thank Chuck Davis for sharing with us the ship model that is out in the hallway. If you didn't have a chance to look at it, please do on your way out. He made it. I mean, I'm just overwhelmed by how beautiful it is, so I hope you'll take a look at it on the way out. But don't touch it. When we were developing topics for this series, I did some research about significant events in the late 20s, which had a connection with our area, and I was intrigued to find that one important thing that happened during that period, and that was about an American icon that, unlike the other subjects we've examined, actually had its origins here on St. Simon's. A major restoration of the most famous warship in America began during that period. Tonight, our guest, Margarita Deasy, will tell us about those origins and about other significant events in the history of USS Constitution. Margarita has been a museum curator and maritime historian for 30 years. She's worked at some fascinating historic sites and museums, including the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Hartford, Connecticut, the National Museum of American History, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, Mystic Seaport, and the USS Constitution Museum. Currently, she works for the U.S. Navy as historian for the USS Constitution. She holds a BA from the College of the Holy Cross and an MA from George Washington University. And she studied at Sotheby's Institute in London. And she also has been a professor at Tufts University in the Museum Studies program. So she's very accomplished.
Or I've been around the block too many times.
As some of you may remember, Margarita spoke to the Society 4.5 years ago. I was unable to attend, but I heard so many rave reviews of her talk that I was happy to have an excuse to invite her back. Thank you for agreeing to come and share with us the fascinating story of USS Constitution.
Thank you, Mimi. We were reminiscing this afternoon, actually, about when I was here 4.5 years ago. I was here in January. I don't know if any of you were here when I gave that talk. Oh, you have to leave now. Because you know all the story. Excuse me. I'll try to come up with something new so that we have some new information. So I left about 2 feet of snow in January in Boston when I came down the last time. And I loved it. I loved being down here. And I left 50-degree weather this morning to come down here. I'm loving this in a different way. Just put it that way. I am loving this in a different way. The connections are, as Mimi said, are amazing. And I also want to thank Leanne Stroud. I know she's here somewhere. Here she is sitting waiting for that. Leanne contacted me a number of months ago to think about sitting down and giving a talk. And how many of you did read Bill Bryson's book? Have you all read it? Oh, good. A lot of you have. Well, there will be a quiz afterwards. Because I started teaching in a week and a half, so I have to get really in the mode of giving quizzes and teaching. So we'll have a quiz about 1927 and see what you remember from Bill's book. But when you take a topic, when you narrow down in a period of time, a part of a country, it really gives you that wonderful opportunity to shine that close lens on something that you might think about in sort of an overarching, breezy kind of way. But when you start to really drill down, and Bryson does it with the summer of 1927, and then as you have with your speakers, as Mimi mentioned, you've had a way to really look at what was going on in the country just through that one lens of 1927. The year of 1927 is special for me because of US's Constitution. And I'll reveal some other little secrets later on as we go ahead. Can everyone hear me at this point? Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Okay, good. If you can't, let me know, because I'm used to talking to 500 people outside at a time at Mystic Seaport, so I can project way beyond the back wall. So I'm happy to do so. So I think we can have the lights now, that would be great. And let's see if I can make this work. Okay, here we go. All right. So, yours says Constitution. What's her nickname, by the way? What's Constitution's nickname? Excellent. Oh, I love that participation. You're better than my students. And you're not even getting a grade for this. You're just enjoying yourselves. Yes, Old Ironsides. And why, of course, is she called Old Ironsides? Because of that amazing sort of secret ingredient inside, which is the live oak, of course, that you so well know here on St. Simon's Island. And why does Old Ironsides, why does the U.S. Constitution have to be built? Well, in the 1790s, of course, the Revolution was long over, and the Navy that we had in the American Revolution was gone. The last frigate, called the Alliance, was sold in 1785. And from 1785 until the Naval Armament Act of 1794, there was no Navy to protect the American merchant fleet. And of course, after the Revolution is over, this country is nearly bankrupt. This brand new country is nearly bankrupt, and it's going to be through commerce, and especially through international trade, that this country is going to get up on its feet. I won't say back on its feet, because it's a brand new country. So it really has to get up on its feet. And the merchant fleet is sailing extensively to the Mediterranean. And there, they're being attacked by the Algerine corsairs and the Tripolitan corsairs out of North Africa. And so you see the quote at the top of the screen there, whereas the depredations committed by the Algerine corsairs on the commerce of the United States render it necessary that a naval force should be enacted. And so finally Congress is convinced in March of 1794. Now, of course, if you're going to build something brand new, it doesn't happen overnight, especially in the 1790s. And so the authorization was to build 6 frigates. And a frigate is a type of warship. And I'll explain that in a little bit when I have an illustration of Constitution up on the screen. And of course, to build these 6 vessels, they needed all the materials to put them together. And so St. Simon's Island was one of the areas that the wood was cut, the live oak was cut. As you know, it was cut at Cannons Point, which I hope to, I've been to Port Frederica, that's as far north on the island as I've been, so hopefully I'll get up to the Cannon Point area tomorrow and pay my respects out there. That's where the live oak was cut. And John T. Morgan was the wood cutter. He was actually from my home state of Connecticut. So imagine a guy from Connecticut in the 1790s sent down here to St. Simon's Island, not knowing at all what he was going to encounter. And you see some of his quotes here. I lost a lad with fever, and I have it now, and everybody is sick. And if you was here, you would curse live oak. John Morgan is writing to the designer of these frigates, Joshua Humphreys. He was a Quaker from Philadelphia. And Joshua Humphreys, this is actually an illustration of his shipyard in Philadelphia with the USS Philadelphia being built, that frigate. The design with the live oak was always from the very beginning. This wasn't an afterthought. It was known that, in fact, you see this quote here from Captains Barry, Dale, and Truxton in December of '94. They are fully convinced, and they are actually convincing the federal government, that if you build the vessels with live oak, they will last much, much longer than a vessel built with conventional white oak. The upfront cost was going to be exorbitant. In fact, it was already known that the calculation was it was going to cost you 5 times more if you built a vessel with live oak. But the calculation was that the vessel would last potentially 5 times longer. So you spread out those costs, you amortize those costs. And so everyone was convinced that live oak was the material to be used. And these are some late 17th century, late 18th century, early 19th century illustrations of cutting large timbers. You had these enormous balks that you would be dragging the large timbers out of the swampy areas. And as you know, you go into the forest and you don't just willy-nilly cut down any tree that you want. You would actually go into the forest with a pattern in hand. They were called molds. And it was basically like a light plywood pattern. Think of like a dress pattern. And you lay the paper pattern down on the fabric, and then you cut the fabric out according to the pattern. Well, you have the same thing here with these lightweight molds. You carried those into the forest, And you basically kind of place them up against the trees. And with those wonderful branches and arms coming out of the live oaks, you could basically envision, could you get a knee out of this? Could you get a breast hook out of this? Could you get a stern hook or a transom wing? And then that would be the tree that you would cut. And you would side the tree in the forest so that you try to take off any excess material you don't need. And you also wanted to make the sides somewhat flat so that this wood could then be, of course, stacked into the hold of a transport vessel that's going to sail from St. Simon's back north to carry this wood to the 6 different shipyards where the frigates were being built. Constitution was finally launched on October 21st, 1797. It took an awfully long time to build these vessels. In fact, they really only were able to build 3 at the very beginning, between 1794 and 1797, partly because, well, largely because all the wood was still in the forest, the hemp was still in the fields to be cut, to be turned into rope, the flax was still in the fields to be turned into the sails. I mean, this was, you talk about a startup situation, this was the ultimate startup. They didn't have anything in hand to build these vessels. But finally, Constitution is the third of the first 3 to be launched. Can you name the other 5? Okay, here's quiz time now. Are you all sharp? Are you all, okay, you're still with me, good. Okay, can you name the other 5 frigates? Constellation.
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia's in the next crowd. She's actually a subscription ship, and this is for Philadelphia burning up here, and we'll talk about her in just a moment. So hold the thought about Philadelphia. So we have Constellation. Where do we live? What country do we live in? The United States. Very good, United States. What's the title of the person that runs this country? President. Very good. What's the body of water off Annapolis, Maryland? Very good, excellente, and yes, there's always one more. I always forget one of them eventually. What's the name of the body of folks on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C.? Congress. Very good. So it's Constitution, Constellation, Congress, Chesapeake, 4 C's, and then United States presidency. So easy, so easy. We're so smart. As we'd say in Boston, wicked smart. You're wicked smart. So of those 6, Constitution is the only one left. Out of the 6, she's the only one left. The Constellation that is sitting in Baltimore Harbor today is the 2nd Constellation. She was launched in 1854-55, and she had a Civil War career. Constitution, it does take 3 tries to launch her. The first 2 attempts were not very successful. She was the biggest vessel ever built in Boston up to that time. In fact, these 6 vessels, by the time they're finished and launched between 1797 and 1800, they are the largest ships, whether they're merchant or navy, ever built up to this point in time in this country. And no one really knew what to expect. And so for the first initial launch for Constitution, which was supposed to happen on September 20th, 1797, in the north end of Boston. If you've been to Boston, it's where the Italian restaurants are. And if you haven't been to Boston, come to Boston for the Italian restaurants and you can see where Constitution was launched. So basically, this little handbill was sent around the city, and he's saying, I want you to all come down. This is Colonel Claghorn, who oversaw the construction. I want you to come down and see the launch of this amazing frigate, but she's so big that we're actually really afraid that when she goes into the water, she's going to set up a swell of the water, the height of which cannot be calculated, and therefore those women and children shouldn't stand too close to the edge of the water because they'll be washed away by the tidal wave. Boston Harbor was a lot bigger then than it is now, and yet that's how awesome, I mean, in the true sense of the word awesome, awestruck. That's how awesome, this is a 20th century painting, a little fanciful, but that's how awesome she was. It had taken 3 years, everyone saw her building. She towered over every building, every warehouse in the north end, with the exception of the steeple of the Old North Church, where the lanterns had been hung from Paul Revere so many years before. And when she's finally successfully launched on October 21st, 1797, some people thought she would be unlucky, because it did take 3 tries. But how would they know that she'd survived 217 years and still be with us today? And I'm going to skip over the quasi-war with France, which is an undeclared war, and I hope if there are any Frenchmen in the audience who will not take offense at that. But it's an undeclared war under President John Adams' administration. It is where Constitution sees her first action down in the Caribbean. But we move on. We have to keep going here. We have a lot of territory to cover tonight, so we're going to jump ahead here to the Barbary Wars. If any of you, do we have Marines in the audience? Any former Marines? Excellent. Semper Fidelis. Thank you for your service. How about Navy? Do we have any Navy folks? Excellent. Air Force? Air Force? How about Air Force? Very good. Coast Guard. There's got to be some Coast Guard. No Coast Guard? Oh, good. Excellent. Oh, yeah, there you are, Bob. Thank you for raising your hand. Fabulous. All right. Did I forget anyone along the way? Oh, Army. My father served in the Army. He'd be very upset. Thank you very much. Excellent. All right. So we all know the Marine Corps hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. This is the shores of Tripoli. This is Constitution. She is the flagship of the Mediterranean Squadron, and she is leading the fleet in to bombard the palace at Tripoli. Commodore Edward Preble is in charge of the fleet, and there are some amazing heroics in this period of time. It is the first major overseas, far-distant deployment of the new United States Navy. It is where Constitution really sees her first action. She was actually so large that she couldn't sail fully into the harbor of Tripoli, so she has her smaller fleet that's able to get up under the walls of the palace, but she was able to lay siege to the palace. And in the palace was the captain of the ill-fated Philadelphia. So we mentioned Philadelphia earlier, and that was Captain William Bainbridge. And Bainbridge and his crew accidentally ran Philadelphia aground in the harbor of Tripoli on Halloween, although no one knew it as Halloween at the time, but October 31st, 1804. And so here was now Captain Bainbridge and a crew of well over 300 men trapped in the palace of Tripoli. And so as the bombardment is happening, the walls are crumbling literally on top of Bainbridge's head. He does survive to fight another day, literally. And Stephen Decatur is, of course, the great hero of the Barbary Wars. He is the one who's given the assignment to go into the harbor of Tripoli under disguise and recapture Philadelphia. She cannot be taken out of the harbor, but instead they blow her up. And they blow her up right under the walls of the Palace of Tripoli. And for that, Stephen Decatur is nearly immediately fleeted up. He's lieutenant by rank when he takes on this command. And he is fleeted up to a full captain at the tender age of 25. There has never been anyone in the United States Navy since to make the rank of captain at the age of 25. Do the names Decatur and Bainbridge mean anything to you here in Georgia? Excellent, I was hoping so. You've obviously got Decatur County, which of course has Bainbridge in it. So interesting, isn't it interesting that you have the one county with the two names right in it? These two men are linked because of the Barbary War, basically because of the blowing up of Philadelphia, the bombardment with Constitution. Bainbridge is eventually released. Decatur is instrumental in that. And their history would continue together, not just in the names of your counties and towns and cities here in your state, but in the 1820s, William Bainbridge would be Stephen Decatur's second at his duel. Decatur dueled James Barron outside of Washington, D.C., and Decatur was mortally wounded in the duel. And so that bright light, that young captain, the hero of the Barbary War and of the War of 1812 was killed actually for a very painful long death, and Bainbridge was his second. So their lives were inextricably linked, which is really kind of interesting when you think about how history presents itself. We jump ahead to the War of 1812. I don't know if it's dawned on you, but today is the beginning of the commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the burning of Washington by the British. They marched on Washington around this time in August of 1814 and were in the White House. The Madisons had fled. Dolly waited to the last moment, Dolly Madison, and then she took the papers that her husband instructed, the silver, and the large portrait of George Washington that was bolted to the wall. In fact, the frame had to be broken. The portrait was rolled up and thrown into the back of a wagon and raced out of the city of Washington. Madison himself escaped from the city, and the Library of Congress was burned, the Capitol was burned, and the Washington Navy Yard was actually torched by the United States Navy so that it couldn't fall into the hands of the British. And why? Why was all this happening in 1814? Well, because in June of 1812, James Madison, President Madison, had it. He delivered people now call it the war message, although he never called it that. On June 1st, 1812, he delivered a message to Congress, basically saying that the force that the British Navy had been imposing upon the American merchant fleet, series of hostile acts going all the way back to 1807, where American merchant fleets were being stopped, men were being impressed into the Royal Navy, vessels were being halted from being able to trade. The United States was neutral in a world war. Who was at war? It was France and England, and they'd been at war since 1793. So here's George III, the same king. Do you remember him? He's that guy who was on the throne in 1775. He was still there. He'd be there until 1821. And here's Napoleon. By 1812, Napoleon has completely come to power, and this is a world war. This is a world war when you think about the oceans and the continents that are crossed. And the United States is the neutral territory and wants to trade equally, and neither France nor England wants us to trade with the other. And so the war message is brought to Congress on June 1st. On June 17th, the Senate voted 19 to 13 in favor of going to war. This would be the closest vote ever in the history of this country to declare war on a foreign power. We would never have such a close vote since then. And the 18th of June is when the president signs the declaration of war. That is the official start of the War of 1812. And so the war begins over the right as a sovereign, neutral nation to trade with whomever we wish to trade, and over the impressment of our men on our merchant fleets, in our merchant fleet. And so the slogan of the war, you've probably heard this before, is free trade and sailors' rights. That was actually put on banners. It was paraded around towns and cities. It was even written on some of the sails of some of the warships as they would go into battle. And this would be a war that would cross international borders, because the United States, one of its goals in the War of 1812, at which it does not succeed, is to take Canada. That was a goal in the American Revolution, at which we did not succeed. And once again, the goal was to take Canada. And Thomas Jefferson was so convinced that those Canadians were going to welcome us with open arms. I am partially Canadian, and I don't know how I feel about that. That he said, Thomas Jefferson said in a letter to a colleague, that it would be just a mere matter of marching across the border, and the Canadians would welcome us and say, absolutely, and sure, let's do it, let's join hands. And of course it didn't happen. We crossed the border several times, and we were unsuccessful every time. And the British would cross from Canada down into the United States, and we stymied them at all costs. And we also did bring our Navy to two oceans, to the Pacific and to the Atlantic. So it is an all-encompassing war in that sense. Constitution would have stunning, spectacular success in the War of 1812. She has a total of 3 battles, and her first battle is just 2 months really after the declaration of war, on August 19, 1812, and that is this image right here. 300 miles off Halifax, Nova Scotia, Constitution would meet up with HMS Guerriere, which is a French-built vessel but captured by the Royal Navy in 1806 and brought into the Navy. And in this battle that would last about 35 minutes, this is what Guerriere would look like. She was completely dismasted in the water, and she was in a sinking state. This is a stunning, stunning revelation when the news goes back to England. And you see the quote at the top here. This is the Times of London. It is not merely that an English ship has been taken, but that it has been taken by a new enemy, an enemy unaccustomed to such triumphs. This is the first frigate-to-frigate war or battle, where, in other words, 2 vessels of equal nature, where the United States naval frigate bests a Royal Naval frigate. And what is a frigate? A frigate is a square-rigged vessel. So it has 3 masts with square sails on all 3 masts, and you have 1 covered gun deck. And you see Guerriere is a frigate with her white painted gun stripe. She has 1 covered gun deck, and Constitution has 1 covered gun deck. So they are of equal class. Constitution is physically slightly larger, but they are essentially of equal class. And for the British to surrender was a stunner, literally. And then Constitution would replay this scenario all over again with a different captain. So this was Isaac Hull. The gallant Captain Hull, as he is called here in the newspaper headline. And this would be our friend, someone's friend, William Bainbridge. He resurrects his reputation which was pretty low after being captured by the Tripolitans in the Barbary War and losing Philadelphia. But he steps aboard Constitution, he rallies the men to his side, and he sails off boldly to the South Atlantic and off the coast of Brazil on December 29, 1812, in a battle that lasts nearly 3 hours. This was a slugfest. Bainbridge is severely wounded in the battle and refuses to leave the deck. The wheel of Constitution is shot away in the first 30 minutes of the battle, and they have to steer the ship from a tiller that's 2 decks below, so the men that are steering can't even see what's going on. It's an amazing, amazing, amazing battle. The captain of Java, Henry Lambert, was mortally wounded in the battle, and he would die several days later. He was brought to Brazil, and he died in Brazil, and he's buried there. This really is a supreme triumph for Constitution. And in fact, Constitution gains her nickname Ironsides in the Guerriere battle. A sailor purportedly notices that when the British cannon shot are hitting the sides of Constitution, that some of them are hitting and just falling right off her sides. And supposedly he yelled out, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron." And we know that she's called Ironsides almost immediately because after the Guerriere battle in September of 1812, she goes back to Boston to be repaired so that Bainbridge can come aboard to go out for the next engagement. And the newspapers in that fall of 1812 are calling Constitution Ironsides at that point in time. So there must be something to that story. Constitution would go on and have a 3rd victory in this war. She is the only vessel to have such a record in the War of 1812, and that would be her very last engagement of the war, very late in the war. This is February of 1815. In fact, the war was technically over. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed, desirous of terminating the war, which has unhappily subsisted between Great Britain and America, and restoring peace. That's some of the language of the Treaty of Ghent. Do you know who was there as the American representative in Ghent? Now it's in Belgium today. He's become the future president of the United States. Do you know who it was? He was the minister to Russia.
John Quincy Adams.
Excellente, you know your history. You're probably from Massachusetts, that's why you know, right? Yes, John Quincy Adams. So he's on that world stage from the very beginning. His father trained him very, very well, and he is the American representative in Ghent for the peace treaty, which was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. And then the treaty is put on a ship and sailed across the ocean. And it doesn't get over here until January, and then it's put on a post rider, and it's sent down to Washington, and it doesn't get to Washington until February. And that's why the war isn't actually over until about February 17th, 1815. And because the intelligence took a long time, there's no Twitter or Facebook or instant messaging or anything like that, or even carrier pigeons, it takes a while for that intelligence to get out there. And so that's why this February 20th, 1815 battle, which is 2 against 1, Siam and Levant are battling the single Constitution off the coast of the island of Madeira. So they're all the way across the Atlantic. It is a legitimate win for Constitution. In fact, New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans would happen in January of 1815. That's where Andrew Jackson becomes the hero of the War of 1812 on land. And he would ride to the White House because of that legacy. That is considered a legitimate battle. The very last naval battle of the War of 1812 would take place in June of 1815. It took that long for the information to get out there. Constitution's reputation is secure. She is Old Ironsides. The National Intelligencer, which is a national newspaper, let us keep Old Ironsides at home. She has become a nation's ship and should be preserved in honorable pomp as a glorious monument of her own and of our other naval victories. Let us preserve her as a precious model, an example for future imitations of illustrious performances. In fact, they were discussing that a dock should be built in Boston, a big stone dock. And they would install her in the dock and build a big barn over the dock and preserve her forever, like that. Well, it's a lovely idea, but you know how these things go. It never happens the way we think about it. You know, the legacy of the War of 1812. We get USS Constitution and her future career, which we're going to talk about as we go along here. But remember the other major legacy
of the War of 1812 is the enduring peace between the United States and Canada. Remember, it's the longest undefended border anywhere in the world, is the border between the United States and Canada, and the peace between Great Britain and the United States. Because of that peace treaty signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, World War I and World War II, the Allies are the allies who they are because of the Treaty of Ghent. That's how history, one thing always affects the other. So we're now commemorating the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the War of 1812, that tragic, tragic Great War, the war to end all wars. And that allied situation of the United States and Great Britain goes all the way back to Christmas Eve of 1814. Pretty cool. So, Andrew Jackson, hero of the War of 1812, President of the United States, dumps out of the White House John Quincy Adams, by the way. John Quincy Adams became the 6th president, and he does not get reelected, and it's Andrew Jackson who becomes the 7th president of the United States. And when the Constitution is being rebuilt in 1833-34, the commandant of the Boston Navy Yard, the Charlestown Navy Yard, where I work today, decided it would be really great to have a figurehead of Andrew Jackson on the bow of the ship, because he's the president after all. Well, by the time this Andrew Jackson figurehead was carved and placed on the bow of the Constitution, Bostonians hated Andrew Jackson. This was 1834, and he had refused to sign the new sort of lease on the Second Bank of the United States, which would basically begin and precipitate the 1837 collapse, financial collapse or depression of the United States. And so all the merchants of Boston absolutely hated Andrew Jackson. So when his figurehead is put on the bow, a captain from Cape Cod came up, and on a dark and stormy night, I don't make this up really, I couldn't make this up if I tried. I have a good imagination, but even my imagination pales in comparison. The captain from Cape Cod climbed up onto the bow of Constitution, and he sawed off the top of Andrew Jackson's head. He wanted to take his whole head, but there was a bolt running down through Andrew Jackson's neck, kind of like Frankenstein. And so he could only take the top. He took the cranium, because Andrew Jackson had a really big head, so he took his cranium, and he paraded that around Boston, and everyone thought that was the greatest thing. And the head survived. The head made its way to France in the later 19th century, and then came back and is now in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York, in New York City. And about 5 years ago, we got a call from the history detectives. If any of you watch the history detectives on public television, you know Elise Morgan was one of the detectives. She called us up, and she said, I have a client who thinks they have the lips from Andrew Jackson. And I said, sure you do. But there was a little label on the back, and we did research, and this television show was shot. We can go online and see it. And sure enough, when Elise, that's Elise's hand, matched the lips up to it, you can see, of course, the good curator like Mimi wearing the white gloves, is holding the top of Andrew Jackson's head. Notice how his lips match right up to the bottom of his nose there. So his lips survived, separate from his head, for about 150 years. That's why I love my job. You can't make this stuff up. So Constitution starting in the 1830s is going to go through a series of rebuilds. She's an older vessel. Time is passing. So she's rebuilt in the 1830s. She's rebuilt in the 1850s. And in fact, the 1830s rebuild is partly because there was a perceived inaccurate threat in 1830 that the ship was going to be torn apart. And Oliver Wendell Holmes had written a poem. Maybe some of you had to commit this to memory. The poem was called Old Ironsides, written in 1830. And this is the first stanza. I tear her tattered ensign down, long has it waved on high. And many an eye has danced to see that banner in the sky. Beneath it run the battle shout. Burst the cannon's roar. The meteor of the ocean air shall sweep the clouds no more. He calls her the meteor of the ocean air. He calls her the eagle of the seas. And he says, my goodness, if you're going to destroy her, don't just take her apart. That's a horrible thing to do to this amazing warship. Instead, give her to the god of storms, the lightning and the gale. He wanted her to be given kind of like a Viking funeral. Well, the poem became a rallying cry for people around the country. The Navy was never really going to tear the ship apart, but it spurred them on to restore her and rebuild her, and that's the 1833-34 rebuild. And then the 1850s rebuild, where she started to make her transition to become a training ship for the United States Naval Academy, which is brand new in Annapolis. And her later years here would be mostly as a training ship. She sits out the American Civil War in Newport, Rhode Island, which is where the United States Naval Academy went to. It decamped from Annapolis and went to Newport, and she became a stationary training ship. She would do sail training cruises up and down the coast. This is a photo taken, the only photograph of her ever taken of her under sail in the summer of 1881 off of Virginia, the coast of Virginia. And, you know, there were different rebuilds off and on. The 1870s was extensive. Here is her live oak framing. You finally get to see it. Most of the time you never can because she's always covered in her outside planking. Look at how dense that structure is. Those are her iron sides. There's no place for the shot to penetrate. Live oak cut green, a cubic foot, weighs about 75 pounds. White oak cut green, a cubic foot weighs only about 50 to 55 pounds. The difference is tremendous, really, really tremendous. This is a period of time, I love this period. Don't you love her? Isn't she beautiful? I think she's pretty great. I know you think I'm crazy. Well, I like this period. She has a bar built over and she's called a receiving ship, and she was a place where men could get their orders changed, and she sat up in the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Kittery, Maine from the early 1880s to 1897 with this barn over her. And I like this because the Navy found a use for her. And if they hadn't found a use for her, she would have fallen apart and disintegrated. I wouldn't have a job today. And I wouldn't be here with all of you lovely people. So this is a vested interest, right? I have a vested interest. They built a barn. They accidentally, in a way, preserved her. And in 1897, her 100th anniversary rolled around, and the city fathers, Henry Cabot Lodge, and John Fitzgerald, Honey Fitzgerald, the grandfather of the future president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, got together and said, hey, Old Ironsides is up at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, let's bring her back to Boston and celebrate her 100th anniversary. And so they did. They brought her to Boston. This is a photograph of her in about 1900. And they had a great party on October 21st. They said, woohoo, great, she's 100 years old. And then they all walked away and left her sitting there. And that's not a good thing to do. You can't leave wooden ships sitting around. So they did a really quick restoration in 1906, not very extensive. And then in 1925, a structural survey was done of the ship, and she was in dire, dire condition. This is a photograph of her just before she went into dry dock. She was barely held together. In fact, if you look closely, it might be easier if I just point it out. There's a steel cable that is belted all the way around the ship. And there's a steel cable that actually goes from her stern up and over to her bow, and that's what's holding her bow and her stern together. They were actually afraid that when she went into the dry dock, and when they pulled the water away from her, that she would actually fall apart, because they felt that the water was what was holding her together at that point in time. That's how bad she was. She really had not been properly rebuilt since the 1870s. It had been nearly 50 years. And so a huge fundraising effort. This is where we start thinking about our friend Bill Bryson with his book, One Summer in America. This is that summer. She enters dry dock on June 16, 1927. And I forgot to look up, what's the date of Lindbergh's flight? It's June. It's in June, isn't it, when he does his flight across the Atlantic? It's like June 25th or something like that. So this is right around the time that Lindbergh is flying across the Atlantic. Talk about, change in time and change in history. Here we have a frigate from the 1790s, about to be restored, and Lindbergh is attempting to make the first solo crossing of the Atlantic in an airplane. It's stunning when you think about it. And of course, in the fundraising efforts, as Bryson talks about in the book, the talkies are coming in, the talkie movies, sound movies. One of the last big hits as a silent film is the Old Ironsides film. It's made in 1926. It had a stellar cast. It had Wallace Beery in it and Esther Ralston. It was filmed off the coast of California, on Catalina Island. It was a really, really big hit. And in fact, it's still considered today in the pantheon of silent films in the end of the silent film era. It's considered one of the better silent films that was made. Obviously, the real Constitution was not used. They used a merchant ship and disguised her to make her look like Constitution. And they raised money. That was one of the ways they did raise money, was with the film. And they also did it through the Pennies campaign. I know you're all too young to remember this restoration and to have saved your pennies and brought them to school, but maybe your parents or your grandparents even might have been involved in this. And actually, the Oliver Wendell 1830 poem, Old Ironsides, Oliver Wendell Holmes' poem, was actually brought back to life. And that poem, I Tear Her Tattered Into Down, came back to life again in 1925, 1926, 1927. School children committed that poem to memory, brought in their pennies, nickels, and dimes, and raised $154,000 through change, through pocket change, to be donated to the fund. Over $216,000 was raised by selling souvenirs. So they took wood and copper from the ship. This is a little miniature anchor. This anchor is only about 3 inches long, and it sold for 50 cents in 1927. And in the end, Congress also had to kick in some funds, and the whole restoration cost a little over $920,000, so just shy of $1 million. It was extensive, though. This was an extensive restoration. 85% of the ship was completely rebuilt. Nearly everything above the waterline was replaced. In fact, it's a little tough to see, but what you're looking at here, this is old framing, and here's the new framing being put in. And so they're basically marching down the ship. They're going from the stern to the bow. So here's the new framing being put in, and now they're going to start taking out the old framing and replace it with the new framing. Here she is with the water taken away. Look at how decrepit she looks. I mean, bits and pieces were kind of hanging off of her. She was pretty sad. If she had not been so completely rebuilt, I sometimes despair that so much of the ship was rebuilt at this time, being a historian, being a curator by training. But if she had not been so completely rebuilt, she would not have survived even to World War II. She would not have survived another 20 years. She was in that poor condition. So we have to thank the Navy and all those children and all those people that bought souvenirs because that's what funded this ship. And, you know, talk about moments in history. This is October 28th, 1929. What happened the next day? Yeah, the stock market crashed. And so this is the new bowsprit going in, and I hope you notice that there's a man standing right here. I want that job. I think that'd be a great job. I used to climb the rigging on the ship's Mystic Seaport. We didn't wear harnesses, so I think I'd be ready for that job. My mother wouldn't like it, but I think I'd be ready for that job right there. So there they are, blissfully unaware, the day before putting a new bowsprit into the bow of the vessel. The next day the market crashed. And what's interesting, that I was reading journals and things of this time period, no one notes it at all in the Navy records, in the Navy Yard records. No one marks that the stock market has crashed because the initial impact is not yet felt. But then for the next 2 years, the rest of the restoration, the impact, the financial impact would be felt. And there are fits and starts, stopping and starting of restoring this vessel. It just gets dragged out longer and longer and longer and longer. And what's interesting, in the middle of it all, our friend, Charles Lindbergh, hero, after his flight across the Atlantic, came to Boston on the 22nd of July, 1927. Look at this amazing headline. 1 million see Lindbergh. I hope they were wrong, because that's really frightening to imagine a million people in Boston. But, I mean, when the tall ships come to Boston today, you know, like when we have a big week of tall ships in July for an anniversary, you know, we might have 4 to 6 million over the whole week. But imagine the Bay Capital. Look at this. Look at this is Boston Common. This is where he was. He's actually down in this little part of the photograph, speaking supposedly to everyone. Hundreds collapsed, and one actually died in the crush of the crowd and the heat and everything. Did he visit Constitution? And the reason I ask that question is because this is one of those prints that was sold to help raise money for Constitution. It's signed by a guy who was a rear admiral at this point in 1927, and he had actually served aboard Constitution in 1878, signed by the Secretary of the Navy, Curtis Wilbur. This is this corner down here, Curtis Wilbur, Secretary of the Navy, Philip Andrews, who was in charge of the restoration, and then Leland Jordan, who was the commander of the Navy, and then look whose signatures down the bottom. Charles A. Lindbergh. And you know what the really interesting thing is? We have no record of him coming to the Navy Yard or visiting the ship. So the new mystery that we have is, where did he sign this? Where did he sign this print? Did he sign it in Washington, D.C.? because maybe the Secretary of the Navy kept this in his office and his dignitaries came through, almost like a scrapbook in a way, a souvenir, what did you call them, when people sign their signatures? Autograph, thank you. I have something brain freeze for a little bit. Little autograph book. Maybe this is his equivalent of an autograph book. But we have a nice little interesting 1927 history here that involves Charles Lindbergh. And to thank the nation, because this was an amazing undertaking. The money and the material that was donated over this 4-year extraordinary restoration, the United States Navy decided to thank the nation by taking the ship on what became known as her national cruise. She was towed to all 3 coasts of this country. So up and down the Atlantic coast, around the tip of Florida, through the Gulf, through the Panama Canal, up and down the west coast, and then back again. She visited 76 ports for 90 stops, because some ports she'd visit twice because she was going up and down the coast. And so she, like Washington, D.C., she visited at least twice. And she visited many ports in California twice, actually. 4.6 million men, women, and children visited that ship between 1931 and 1934. Think about it. There is no interstate highway at that point in time. And most people, it's the crux of the Depression, most people couldn't have afforded to put petrol in an automobile if they owned an automobile. So this is by bus, this is by rail, this is by trolley car, and people are coming out to the coasts to see this vessel, to see this icon, to see this extraordinary ship that some of them, maybe been following in newspapers for 4 years. She was outfitted with a full set of sails. They didn't actually sail her. She was physically towed by a minesweeper named Grieve, USS Grieve, the whole way because she was scheduled to keep. Posters were put up. Look, this is one of those posters. Be sure to visit her. You didn't want to miss her because she went everywhere. These are just some amazing shots. So this is her actually going through what is the real Golden Gate, and that is the Narrows, right there off San Francisco, over which today is the bridge. In fact, this is the beginnings of the bridge. The bridge hadn't even been built yet. The footings are just being started in 1933, and here she is going through the Narrows there, the Golden Gate. There she's going through the bridge of Corpus Christi, Texas. This is one of my favorite. This is a great photo. My brother and sister-in-law now live out in the Tacoma, Washington area, and I just visited Olympia for the first time last year. Isn't that a wonderful image of her with the state capitol and Olympia behind her? The way the coastline happens to go in that area there. And then, I think my pointer has died. And then this is her going through the Panama Canal. I'm sorry?
It's on the side if you want to turn
I
it.
know, and I think it's on, or did I turn it off? Oh, thank you, Leanne. She's my friend back there. I'm obviously not proficient at this mechanical stuff. Does it work? Let's see if as long as the slides work, let's move on to Georgia. That's what's most important, isn't it, after all? Let's move on to Georgia. Of course she has to come to Georgia. She goes to Savannah first. In 4 days, she had over 33,000 visitors. I mean, look at the staggering numbers that are visiting. Staggering numbers that are visiting. And then she came here to Brunswick. And of course, she had to come to Brunswick because right next door here to St. Simon's, recognizing, and they are truly recognizing. Mimi was showing me the wonderful newsletter or magazine that came out from the, what's the name of the Cloister? The Cloister newsletter. And the pirates came and visited Constitution. Your very own pirates actually captured Constitution. It's the only time the enemy pirates have set foot on the deck of Constitution. Was right here, ladies and gentlemen. You should be very proud of that fact. I think poor Commander Gulliver, I guess his name was Gulliver, and so this became known as Gulliver's Travels. I think poor Gulliver was never the same after the Lady Pirates came on board. These numbers are staggering. The busiest day that she had, let's see if I can go back here, was actually, let me go back one more. The busiest day was actually in San Pedro. So this is actually a shot of San Pedro, California. And the busiest day in the whole 3 years was March 3rd, 1933. 36,400 people visited the ship in 1 day. The line was 4 people abreast and 3 miles long, supposedly. Now, you only walked on the top deck, but even still, imagine getting, I'm actually frightened to even think about it, 36,000 people across the deck of that ship in one day, 36,400 to be specific. Unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. The crowds were truly staggering. One of the fun statistics about Georgia is that in Savannah, she received a 21-gun salute, which is only appropriate, of course. And while in Brunswick, very coincidentally, the 1 millionth visitor happened to step on the deck of the ship. I suspect they clicked ahead a little bit more. Yeah, you're 1 million, there you go. And she just happened to be Miss Ruth Whittle, who was the daughter of the former mayor, John Whittle. Isn't that amazing? I think history's pretty incredible, you know. I'm continuing coincidences. I think not. Oh dear. So, Georgia, thank you, darlings. You've been fabulous. You've got a stake, a big stake in the Constitution, and you really welcomed her in 1931, which was extraordinary. If you jump ahead, business as usual to a certain extent, except that, of course, World War II intervened. The Queen visited, always a special moment. She's the only reigning monarch to step foot on the deck of the Constitution, so that is a special moment. Other restoration work in 1949, she finally needed a new bowsprit. That 1929 one needed to be taken out, so she got a new bowsprit. 1954, there was actually a piece of legislation that basically said the Constitution was to always be officially homeported in Boston. In 1947, to celebrate the 150th anniversary, the United States Postal Service issued a stamp, a really lovely stamp actually. And then in 1976, a grove of white oaks were set aside in Crane, Indiana, so that the white oak could be grown and harvested for future restorations. And we are now just harvesting that oak that was set aside 40 years ago. So we've had about 30 or 40 white oak trees cut in Crane, Indiana. They're going to be shipped to us in Boston for the next restoration. Because the work marches on. She is an old ship, and life goes on for all of us, and we all get older, and it'd be nice if they just threw a couple $1 million at me every 20 years. I'd look pretty good. So this is a really significant restoration in the late 20th century. This is the 1992 to 96 restoration. This is when I sort of entered the scene when I worked at the USS Constitution Museum. She was once again hauled into Dry Dock 1. And they had to remove the curve in her backbone. She had a 14-inch hog, and that's what this red arrow is showing you. In her backbone, they had to straighten her out. They had to put new struts and structural members back into her that she used to have that had all been removed from her. Structures called diagonal riders, which were very important. And by putting the colored illustration with the red decking and the green knees and the yellow diagonal riders, that was all material that was there from the 1790s, but had been long ago removed. And by removing it all, it's like slowly taking the studs out of the walls in your house. Eventually, it's not going to be standing, or it's going to be really bowed in a certain way. And she was bowed, she was curved. And that was the big goal of the 1992 restoration, was to remove that hog and make her physically strong again. And they accomplished it because they were so successful. The Navy felt confident to take the ship out in July of 1997 in commemoration of her upcoming 200th anniversary. So on July 21st, 1997, for the first time in 116 years, USS Constitution set sail for 1 hour, downwind. It was a very controlled sail. She had 6 sails on her, as you can see, 2 jibs, 3 topsails, and the spanker in the stern. This is a tiny portion of what she would have carried 200 years ago. She carried between 46 and 48 sails for a sail area of over 44,000 square feet of sail, which is over an acre of canvas. And just to give you a sense of how big these sails are, this main topsail is over 3,000 square feet of sail alone. So if any of you sail, compare that to your own boat, and you'll get a sense of comparison. She was escorted by Halliburton and Ramage, and I can never remember which is which. One is a destroyer and one is a frigate. I'm sure you guys know, because you know modern ships, I know. And at high noon, as she started to fire a 21-gun salute under sail, she'd just been set free and released to sail, The Blue Angels went screaming overhead at 350 miles an hour. It was a pretty amazing day, actually. Pretty extraordinary. And she's a cover girl, too. You know, all the pretty girls get to be cover girls. So she was a cover girl for Woodstock magazine. But, you know, the work continues. And my job as historian is to try to fulfill that mission of our organization. We have the Naval History and Heritage Command Detachment Boston, USS Constitution. And I'm the historian of that organization, and our mission is to repair and restore Constitution as far as practicable to the War of 1812 period of time. And so I'm constantly looking at ship plans and models and later 19th century photographs and written documentation and putting all of that together to try to ascertain what the ship might have looked like in 1812. As I was saying to Mimi and Leanne earlier, we don't know everything about the ship. There's always something new to discover. In fact, many people are shocked that we don't know as much as we don't know. Does that make sense? That there's still a lot we need to know, that we need to find out. And so I put together all sorts of packets and information, and one of the things that we were going to do in the 2007 restoration was to reopen the waist of the ship. This had been filled in and covered up in the 20th century, and it was supposed to be open for 1812. And so we got the green light to go ahead and open the waist, and that meant literally cutting four 10-foot sections from either side of the ship. Each section weighed, I forget how many tons. I can't remember now how many tons, but there's several tons. And you can see it's a three-part structure. White oak planking on the outside, there's your live oak framing in the middle, and then white oak planking on the inside. And by taking off these two 40-foot sections and lowering the upper rail, the ship had been dramatically altered in the 1927 restoration. It's a good restoration to preserve the ship, but it was a not so great restoration as far as making her look like 1812. In fact, she looked like everything but 1812 after the 1927 restoration. So we're slowly peeling away the 1927 work and trying to make her look more like an 1812 ship. And so now you see the big open waist. And this was basically the cargo bay, because the big main hatch is right here behind the visitor. And that's how you get all your goods and services on and off the ship. Being a warship, she carried 44 guns. Each of the long guns weighs about 6,000 pounds. You know, you needed to really get these guns on and off. All the gunpowder, all the shot. 450 men lived and sailed aboard a vessel of this size when she was active. You carried about 45,000 gallons of water, which would last you about 3 months. You carried tons of food, miles of rigging. It went on and on and on. And this is going to be the area of the ship that you're going to load it on and off in. And also, too, this netting is where you stored your hammocks. And that became some shelter, sort of, as the men had to run through that area during battle to get to the guns in the bow or the stern. Also, during the restoration of 2007 to 2010, kind of in the middle of it, the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2010, specifically on October 28, 2009, Section 1014, designated Constitution as America's official ship state. So she's not only the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world. You know what the oldest commissioned warship is in the world? It's in England. It's in Portsmouth, England. It's in a dry dock. Thank you. Oh, good. Victory, HMS Victory, which was Admiral Lord Nelson's flagship from the Battle of Trafalgar. She was launched in 1765, so she's 32 years older than Constitution, but she's been permanently dry docked since 1922. So Victory is the oldest commissioned warship in the world, but Constitution is the oldest commissioned warship in the world. She is the oldest vessel in the world that can still sail under her own power, being launched in 1797, and now, top it all off, she's the only ship of state in the whole world. No one else is a ship of state. Because as you all know, if you are literature majors, ship of state is a metaphor. It's a literary metaphor that goes back to ancient times, but is most commonly known because of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Building of a Ship. Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, strong and great. He's an abolitionist. He's written this poem in 1849, 1850. He's very concerned about the state of the country with the slavery situation, and he is deathly afraid that the country is going to be split in two. And the ship of state is the metaphor for the Union, for the United States. And so here we have USS Constitution, named for the document that creates this country, is now the ship of state. It's a wonderful blending of all of that history together. So obviously in 2012, a big year. I don't know if you realize it was a big year, but it was a big year for us in Boston because of course it was the beginning and for the Navy the commemoration of the War of 1812. So there were different port visits up and down the coast. We had a big port visit in the summer of 2012. Constitution sailed on August 19th, which was the actual 200th anniversary date of her battle with HMS Guerriere. Another stamp was issued. This was a series done for the whole War of 1812, so they're releasing one stamp every year. So the 2012 stamp is the oldest known portrait of Constitution from 1803, which was lovely to work with the Postal Service to have that issued. And my colleagues at the USS Constitution Museum launched an amazing website called A Sailor's Life for Me, which is interdisciplinary learning through kind of cartoon animated figures with the history of the ship. So it was an extraordinary signature year for the Navy's history and for Constitution, obviously, in particular. And the summer of 2014, which we've just, well, almost just concluded, was another big year. Because as Mimi mentioned, I used to work at Mystic Seaport in Mystic, Connecticut. And I spent 20 years at Mystic Seaport. And one of the vessels that I climbed on was the Charles W. Morgan. My job at Mystic Seaport was climbing the rigging and setting and furling the sails and rowing boats and doing all sorts of cool stuff. And in this summer of 2014, Mystic Seaport had concluded a 5-year restoration of the Charles Morgan, and she was sailed out of Mystic up the southeastern New England coast and came all the way to Boston, and here is the Charles Morgan and USS Constitution together. It's my whole life in one moment, basically. When I worked at Mystic Seaport, we always said to our visitors, Charles Morgan will never leave the seaport. Well, this is an extraordinary restoration. She's in fantastic shape, the Morgan, and the seaport wanted to see what this whaling ship could do. And so they made a whole suit of sails for her. They learned a tremendous amount sailing this vessel up the coast, and then to have the last port be Boston, to bring these two historic vessels together that have never been together in their whole careers. And this is why Constitution was built. This dry dock in the country, and there she is in the dry dock in 1992. She'll look like that probably next March before the scaffolding goes up. And this will be about 2.5 years of work in the dry dock for the next phase of the next stage of restoration. It's just a continuous process. So we're doing research at this point, we're ordering wood, we're getting ourselves ready for that next restoration. And Constitution, by the way, was the very first warship to ever enter this dry dock in 1833, when that Andrew Jackson controversy happened. And you know, as I was reading Bill Bryson's book, as we kind of bring our story here to a close, and as I said to Mimi and Leanne earlier, 1927, I think I alluded to you earlier too, 1927 is a very important year for me. For two reasons. Because it's when Constitution was restored and I have a job, and it's when baby Yolanda was born. That's my mother. She looks just the same. And so she was born in January of 1927, which is why I'm here, and that's me actually at the wheel of the Charles Morgan underway. I was fortunate to be one of the few people to sail aboard the Morgan on one of the legs this summer. And so this whole idea of thinking of one year, of looking at one moment in history, we can bring these stories right home to our own lives, which is pretty great, and wrap these stories one into the other. The layering is, is always pretty amazing. And I was struck by 1927, not just because of my own personal connections and everything, but just what a wonderful way to look at the moment. Take any year. Start your own Bill Bryson story. Choose the year you were born, choose the year you were married, choose the year you graduated from college, whatever it might be. And then start to look at that year. I've decided I might want to go back and look at the newspapers from the year I graduated from college, because I was certainly oblivious in 1983. It'd be interesting to go back and read the newspapers from 1983. Take those moments and see what we can learn and relearn. And there is Constitution on July 4th, 2012, with the Blue Angels flying overhead in Boston Harbor. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh gosh, let's do our baseball stats. Okay, so how big is Constitution? breadth, she's about 207 feet. Length overall, from the tip of her flying jibboom to the tip of her spanker boom, she's about 306 feet in length. She displaces in excess of 1,900 tons, and her mainmast from the spar deck to the truck is about 172 feet. So she, and to give you a comparison to the Charles Morgan, you can't, my angle of my photograph is great. The Charles Morgan is 113 feet in length, displaces 300 tons, and her wholesale area is only 13,000 square feet. And remember, the wholesale area of this vessel is 44,000 square feet. So she is exactly twice as big as the Charles Morgan. That's how big these warships were to protect this merchant fleet. Morgan is an average-sized whaling vessel of the mid-19th century, and these were considered a little bit of super frigates. They're about 20 feet longer, 10 to 20 feet longer than the French and the British of the same time period in 1812. The other question I may have.
I'm sorry if I have this incorrect, but the trees that were planted or being groomed, I think it was Indiana.
Yes, in Crane, Indiana, right?
Why was Indiana chosen? Was there any other?
Would you like it to be Georgia? Girl, white, are you, does White Oak Road down here? White Oak, I'll call Crane, I'll tell you. Why was Crane, Indiana chosen? Because it's actually a Navy and Army installation in Crane, Indiana. It is the largest base in the United States. Crane has something like 150 miles of roads in it. It's something like 54,000 acres, and it's an ordnance facility. And they need to grow the trees because they actually explode ordnance in different parts of the base, and they need the trees to literally absorb the shrapnel of the ordnance. They actually, the Crane was started during the Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by eminent domain, they actually bought up several towns, so the foundations of the houses are still there, but everyone had to be moved out of this area. And so they purposely grow trees. They do log on a commercial basis out of Crane, so not all the trees are being kept for constitution. In fact, there are only 150 trees so designated, and they're all over this enormous base, and they're now found by GPS, which didn't exist commercially in 1976 when the Crane trees were established. But it's a facility that already exists. It's a place where the trees can just grow beautifully, and then they can be harvested when we need them. So it works out very, very nicely, actually. In the back there, in the red.
Are there any timbers from St. Simon's used in the various restorations?
No, I didn't give you the bad news about the 1927 restoration. No St. Simon's wood was used in 1927. It actually all came out of timber ponds in Pensacola, Florida.
Were they live? They were live oak.
It was live oak, and it was live oak that had been cut in about 1850. It had been put into the timber ponds, and now what's Pensacola Naval Air Station, because that originally had started as a Navy base in the mid-19th century. And the wood was still there, and they actually had plans of where the wood had been sunk, and there were little tags on all the wood, and they basically hauled it all out. In fact, I have some stats. It's an amazing amount of wood that was brought out from Pensacola. Let's see. Live oak, 1855 had been still there. 1,500 tons was shipped from Pensacola, and of that, 900 tons was used in the restoration. So it was a lot of wood, actually. White oak for the 1927 restoration came from southern Ohio and West Virginia. Wood has always come from all over to work. Now we use Douglas fir, and that comes from the Northwest. So we're still getting wood from all over. Anyone from New Jersey? Anyone from New Jersey? Oh, good. That's where the keel of the ship came from. It was white oak cut in Trenton, New Jersey, in summer and fall of 1795. So you get to claim the keel of the ship, which is the oldest part of the ship. Another question. Yes, sir.
Yes, is there any evidence that Joshua Humphreys, the Quaker, had a conscience about designing a ship of war?
So the question is, Joshua Humphreys was a Quaker. Did it disturb him that being a Quaker to design warships? He was eventually read out of his meeting, but it was not because he designed warships. It was actually because of interpersonal relations and family relations. So no, it doesn't appear that he had any problems with designing warships. He had actually designed warships for the American Revolution too, which is why he became the principal designer in 1794 for the beginning of the new United States Navy. He was a known quantity, and the vessels he designed in the 1770s as successful as our Navy was in the Revolution, which wasn't very successful, his vessels were so good. Yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, Bob, yeah.
I read in the Geographic a good many years ago about the Constitution,
Yeah.
and I've forgotten the figure, but can you come up with a number, more or less, of oak trees it took to build it? I had heard something up in the 3,000.
You know, it depends on what species of wood you're using. But yeah, it's anywhere from 1,500 to about 2,500 trees in a vessel of this size. It's substantial. It's really, really substantial. And one of the early quotes on one of my first slides, I think it was down at the bottom of one of the first screens, when Joshua Humphreys was designing these vessels, he not only wanted to have live oak in them because he knew live oak was superior, expensive and difficult to cut initially, but the longevity of the ship, survives battles, is going to pay off in the long run. But he also says that he wants the scantlings, in other words, the dimensional framing of the vessels, to be on the size of a 74. That's what was in the quote, on a 74. And what a 74 was, a 74 gun ship of the line, which is the next class up from the frigate. So the frigate was a nimble, they still are today, they're called fast frigates, FFGs, they're fast frigates. That's the modern vessel that we have today. They carry heavy guns, but they're swift. They were always intended to be the maneuverable vessels, whereas the ships of the line, like HMS Victory, big, heavy, ponderous vessels, 2 or 3 gun decks, covered gun decks, where we have just the one covered gun deck, and they would all just line up in battle formation, the British on one side and the French on the other, and they just blast away each other. Okay? But there's not a lot of maneuvering that's going on. That's what a 74 is. A 74 is a slightly smaller ship of the line, but they have to have massive timbers because they're carrying 74 or more guns. So the weight of the guns alone is tremendous. You don't just want to repel your enemy shot and have a vessel that's going to last and not rot too quickly. Remember, you're going to put a burden of weight onto this ship, which is tremendous, And the ship itself, the structure itself, has to support that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How do they keep the bilges popular?
Today or
I
then?
don't know back then, yeah.
So 200 years ago, you actually had what were called chain pumps. So imagine your bicycle chain, the same kind of sprocket system. You know how you have the big sprocket in the front of the bicycle and the smaller sprocket on the back wheel of the bicycle? Well, take that chain sprocket system, and you think of it on your bicycle, it's horizontal, and now just turn it up. So this is the big sprocket, this is the small sprocket, and the chain goes around, and you've got handles at the top that you're pumping to make this thing move, just like the way you pump your pedals on your bicycle, okay? On the chain are little tiny cups. So as you rotate this chain fast, very rapidly, all those little cups go down into the water and pull the water up, and then they spill out across the deck of the ship and go right over the side. And the chain pump was very simple. So if it broke, it was very easy to repair. But the problem is, it's a chain, just like on your bicycle. And you know how often that can break, or your trousers get caught in the chain, and all of a sudden you've just jammed up the chain. So if there was any trash or debris down in the bilge, and that got picked up into one of those cups and sucked up, your chain was going to break. So they were somewhat efficient, but they were pretty fragile at the same time. By the mid-19th century, she goes to a type of pump we'd be familiar with today. It's a suction piston pump, essentially. And they were either canvas or leather suctions on them, again, with a pump handle action, and they're just drawing the water up and pumping it. They pump it across the second deck. They pump the water across the gun deck, and then it just goes out the scuppers and over the side there. The water doesn't go all the way to the top and the side. It just goes to the second deck. Today we have modern pumps, and they just turn the switch in. Someone in the center? Yes, Jim.
We're very proprietary.
Uh-oh.
How much the U.S. Constitution comes from St. Simons?
Wow. Gee, we've never helped, well, thank you for that question. Next question. My wicked's not too. Your wicked's not. So the statistic we give is that of the 1795 to 1797 ship, so in other words, when she's being built, because it takes 2.5 to 3 years to build her, there's about 8 to 12% of that ship left. Where is that 8 to 12%? It's all pretty much below the waterline. So when you look here, we can see her out of the water. So here's her water line. This is all the stuff that sits out of the water. This is what you normally can't see. So her keel is her backbone that runs down here. So the keel is original. And then the floor timbers, the frame. Think of your backbone. If I were to lay down on the floor, my backbone would be down on the floor, and then my ribs, right, are coming up out of the backbone. The same way with the ship. We've got our keel down here flat, or almost flat on the keel blocks, and then all that framing starts up around the side. Well, the initial part of the framing that comes right in contact with the keel are called the floor timbers. And then from that, all the pieces stage up into the shape of your vessel. So that 8 to 12% is pretty much right down at the bottom. And since that's live oak largely for the framing, not the planking, because the planking is going to be replaced, probably a lot of the 8 to 12%, with the exception of the keel from New Jersey. My friend from New Jersey there, she gets to clank the keel. And that's a pretty substantial stick of wood. In fact, there's actually 3 or 4 pieces all put together. You know, maybe half of that 8 to 12% could be the live oak from St. Simon's. So that's not bad. That's not bad. I've never had to answer that question before. That's amazing. That's because you're so interested and I like that. Yes, please. Yeah.
Isn't that a 20-year cycle that you're, or more often that you're literally pulling it into dry dock?
So the dry dockings are, well, they'd like them to be a little bit more frequently than 20 years, but in the 20th century, well, that's not true. In the post-World War II era, she has only had 2 significant dry dockings. 1973 to 76, and 92 to 96. And the 2007 restoration was actually floating availability because all the work was done above the water line. So then she's going to be in for 2.5 years. This next cycle, though, might be much shorter. So she'll be in for 2.5 years in 2015, spring of 2015 to maybe late 2017, early 2018. But the next cycle could be 10 years later.
So how can we bring it back here?
Don't ask me. The question is, how can you bring her back to Georgia? You know, the National Cruise was an extraordinary undertaking. That 3-coast, 3-year, unbelievable. I mean, let's not even try to imagine what it would cost today to do something like that. I mean, look at what Mystic Seaport just did. That was an extraordinary undertaking. And that was 8 weeks only, 6 ports. That's it. And that was still an amazing, amazing, I mean, just the physical effort of getting that underway. The fundraising, we talked about fundraising, you know, that's a tremendous thing. The other thing is, there is a debate in the historic preservation community, whether you're talking about buildings, whether you're talking about ships, or you're talking about automobiles, or airplanes, or musical instruments. Should you play that Stradivarius violin? Well, everyone claims it's better if you play it. Clocks are better if you wind them. Pianos are better if you tune them. Cars? Well, you take it on the road, the possibility is you could have an accident, right? And ships, you know, they're in a natural element that's fraught with dangers regardless. She is, by law, not able to leave Massachusetts Bay at this moment in time. There was a piece of legislation passed in 1998 that will not allow her to leave Massachusetts Bay. That can be changed, of course. But if you want to start lobbying for it, go ahead. You didn't hear it from me. You didn't hear from me. Yes, sir, all the way back.
Any record of its top-end speed at full sail?
Oh, excellent. Oh, let's talk about that. The question is about top speed. So, USS Constitution, under full sail, displacing in excess of 1,900 tons, could sail over 13.5 knots, which is over 15 miles an hour. Which, when you realize clipper ships, the fastest, the Greyhounds of the sea that are built in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, you know, in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, they attained about 18 knots, and they are totally built for speed. She could sail in excess of 13.5 knots. The remarkable, stunning realization of the Charles Morgan sail this summer And I was there 20 years interpreting this vessel to thousands of visitors, and we always used to claim, oh, these whaling ships, they have very bluff bows, and they were kind of dogs for sailors. Well, she turned out to be a very nimble sailor. She attained 8 knots this summer, which is actually really good when you realize that her waterline length is only 100 feet long. And she's only setting, well, only setting 13,000 square feet, so I say only because in comparison to this big thing. But, you know, we had no idea. We thought these whaling vessels, oh, maybe 6 maximum, they'd be straining doing that. She's half ballasted. She was ballasted this summer as if she was halfway through a voyage, so she was carrying some pretty substantial weight. And they were easily attaining 8 knots, which is pretty great. When Constitution sailed in 1997, we actually didn't have a lot of wind. We had about 5 knots of wind, and she was, actually I think they got to about 7 knots of wind, and she was still getting close to 5 knots or so. Which again is the shape of her hull. She has a magnificent hull, beautiful shaped hull, and beautiful entry. Look at that right there, beautiful entry. She's got an extraordinary exit. You can just see a little bit of it here. At the top of her stern, absolutely spectacular. And a very long waterline. The waterline's 175 feet. Thank you very much.